Recently, my best friend and I have gotten back into Monster Hunter World. We went through Rise as soon as it released last year, and then played some Wild Hearts later on, which was certainly interesting and we plan to go back to, but it was also pretty difficult in ways we weren't vibing with at the time. After a string of games that didn't have much multiplayer staying power for us, like Mudrunner, Anthem, Homefront the Revolution, and Farming Simulator 22, we decided to vent our frustrations a bit with More World, which we'd put several hundred hours into back in 2021, as our first extensive venture into the series. Monster Hunter World is an incredible game, so much so that in 2021, I made a video about how fantastically fair most of the game's core grind was compared to basically everything else, and I hate grinding. But there were a few things we never quite finished due to a sudden, drastic increase in difficulty. After nearly 300 hours, hitting brick walls like Safi Jiva and Alatreon felt like a good place to move on and come back later. So, when we both turned the game back on, we decided to ease ourselves back in. A special arena quest here, a lower master rank quest there, a few of the weird event quests we never did. I even took the time to get the rainbow pigment by decimating and capturing a bunch of low rank and high rank monsters. But eventually, it felt like it was time. Time to stop wasting time. If we wanted Monster Hunter World to stay installed for more than 10 or so hours of extra playtime, we had two options. Start a fresh character and redo what we'd already done with new weapons, or finally work toward becoming the bonktastic hammer gods we knew our characters deserved to be by pushing toward tackling the hardest hunts we'd yet to finish. We'd warmed up, so we decided to simply jump into fights with Alatreon a few times to see if we could get the lay of the land. We remembered that there was a gimmick, but neither of us remembered what it was, and recent world-related YouTube searches I'd done had given me nothing more than the clear picture that a lot of people loathed this fight. As anyone who's learned Alatreon would know, realistically the biggest issue with it as a hunt is that the game doesn't give you any meaningful information on how it works. There are exactly 5 hints as to whether you're doing things correctly or incorrectly, which you're provided by characters like the Handler. One is a vague hint at what you need to accomplish. 3 of them let you know that you're on the right track, and 1 lets you know you're doomed, so you should just abandon quest and try again. But all of this is dependent on you being able to recognize these as hints, and also not letting them fade into the background because you're too busy trying not to be popped like a vigor wasp. Alatreon is one of only a handful of hunts that requires a very specific type of strategy, that requires a very specific type of build, and a very specific order of operations. In fact, outside of highly coordinated exploit strategies that require 4 ultra-powerful hunters, this battle literally isn't meant to be completable unless you play ball. If you haven't played World before, this is so out of the ordinary that if you don't go into Alatreon knowing what's going on beforehand, I argue you stand no chance. Honestly, I'm not even sure how you'd figure out the gimmick to this fight without weeks of attempts and experimentation that would require dozens of hours of grinding for different equipment types or just looking it up. And if you're not employing the right strategy, it's very unlikely that an SOS Flare team is going to be able to carry you through. Why is this, you may ask? Well, let me explain. Alatreon is an elemental hunt target. But more specifically, Alatreon can shift elements, unlike nearly anything else in the game. In the story version of the quest, it will always start in Fire Elemental mode. It can still use Ice and Dragon Element attacks, but it will be Fire Element, meaning it's weak to Ice. Then it moves to Dragon Element for a while, and then finally Ice. The cycle then repeats backwards, going back to Dragon, and then eventually Fire. The reason this is important is because this is actually a hidden DPS check. Right before Alatreon moves to Ice mode, he will do an area of effect attack that can't really be avoided. Outside of very specific and difficult exploit strategies, you cannot survive this if you don't pass the DPS check beforehand, and if you're in a party of 3 or 4 hunters, this is an instant party wipe and hunt failure. You can weaken this attack though by doing enough elemental damage within the fire and dragon phases, which will allow you to heal through it. That's not all though. You see, in Monster Hunter World, there's no way to have multiple types of elemental damage active at once on your weapon, and in this specific fight, the only way to get to a camp and change your weapon is to die to Alatreon, losing one of your 3 team lives. That means you also have to have a way to stop Alatreon from entering the ice phase, because if you come in with an ice weapon, because he's extremely weak to ice in his fire phase, you'll literally do 0 elemental damage once he gets to his ice phase, guaranteeing that his second DPS check AoE attack will end your hunt. Unless you're alone and you haven't died up to that point, but the point is, it's supposed to be a game ender. Well, thankfully, specifically during the dragon phase, Alatreon's horns can be broken. If you break a horn, instead of going to ice after the AoE, Alatreon will revert back to fire. Your goal is to do enough elemental damage during the first and second phase, and break his horn during the second phase, so that you can survive the DPS check and stay out of the ice phase. But this still isn't everything, because Alatreon's dragon element attacks can also cause the Dragon Blight status effect. Dragon Blight makes it so that your attacks don't do any elemental damage. What this amounts to is a build that demands you spread yourself thin. Against a normal hunt, like a Zinogre, you can just use thunder resistance through an elemental resist large meal and you're good. Elemental damage on your weapon is additive. It doesn't change your weapon's attack entirely to that element, so even if you come in with a thunder element weapon that does no elemental damage to Zinogre, your raw weapon damage will still be enough. But here, you have to be resistant to stun if you get hit a lot, Dragon Blight to keep your elemental damage active, have high dragon, fire, and at least decent ice defense to survive his attacks. You need an ice element weapon that does pretty high ice damage, and probably several different abilities that support that, like critical element and affinity up options. You'll probably need speed eating, because the more time you spend on a heal, the less time you're spending doing elemental damage or horn damage to Alatreon. It all stacks on itself, and he's explicitly designed to punish any deficit your build has. And beyond even that, bringing in a more neutral element like water, dragon, or thunder won't work particularly well either, because Alatreon is more resistant to both thunder and water than he is either fire and ice, and because that resistance also rotates depending on the phase he's in, and his dragon resistance is high no matter what. A strategy that relies on one of these elements forgoes needing to break horns, which is good in theory because hitting the head of such a giant, active dragon can be a nightmare for a lot of weapon types. This is smart on paper, but it also means you'd have to be even more aggressive in your attacks and even more coordinated with any team you're on. You have options for how to set up your build. You can focus on using the Dragonproof Mantle to temporarily completely prevent Dragon Blight. There are other mantle options that prevent blights, or things like the Cleanser Booster. You can stack yourself with a bunch of Dragon Resistance decorations, because over 20 Dragon Element Resistance will make you immune to Dragon Blight as well. Or just use Blight Resistance decorations. You can use Null Berries every time you're afflicted. These are all valid options. But keep in mind, this is all just to lower your dragon elemental damage and prevent Dragon Blight. You have so many other things you need to save space for. You can't carry 5 mantles with you. You can't have infinite decorations. You might now understand why using an SOS flare is a risk as well. SOS flares, as the name suggests, allow anyone who answers the call to join your hunt, in case you just desperately need help. But the monster you're hunting instantly gets stronger when another hunter joins you, and then stronger again when a third does. It doesn't get stronger if the final 4th slot is filled, thankfully, but that also means you're at a disadvantage if you fire the flare and don't get a full party of 4 pretty quickly. 3 people is always a disadvantage. Not good in a timed DPS check hunt. If these people don't know exactly what they're doing, you've just raised the difficulty without giving yourself any meaningful assistance. Now, full disclosure, once you have a good build for this fight, and you're comfortable with his patterns, it's not actually too difficult. It's getting to that point that's really frustrating, which is the part I see too many people underplaying in videos discussing whether this fight is good or bad. It's learning what you even need in order to make a good build that's frustrating. It's grinding specific monsters to get specific armor and weapons, and then grinding other event quests for armor spheres, and the guiding lands for materials used to upgrade your armor and augment your weapons. It's potentially getting so fed up that you grind to Master Rank 100 just for the opportunity to get the health regen augment, to give yourself something that helps for survivability. It's committing a wealth of this grind for resources to options you think will work, only to realize it has gaping holes in it, and you have to start over. Or if you find a build online, it's realizing after you grind that this build just doesn't suit your skill-based strengths and weaknesses as an individual player. It's the time the game demands of you beforehand, and the readiness with which it wants to show you that time was a waste. My build really came down to several core elements. An event quest ice hammer that could really easily get me high ice elemental damage. The Furious Rajang pants for the good defenses, decoration slots, and the full health boost ability. The rest of the armor I used was the Azure Age armor set for true critical element, which allowed my elemental damage to crit for like 1.7 times damage, and for the high fire and dragon resistance. I then stacked myself with decorations and charms that boosted my ice damage to max, and I tried to help with my part breaking and affinity. I would always take the elemental resistance large meal, and I'd create an item setup that allowed me to use and make the maximum amount of max potions, which are used much quicker than mega potions and heal you fully. I was gaining quick, excellent heals, but had to do in-battle inventory fiddling much more often. Other than that, I found the Temporal Mantle and Evasion Mantle worked best for maintaining DPS uptime. When Alatreon flies, a skilled player can Slinger Burst him to down him, a less skilled player can Flash Pod him if he's not enraged, and someone with Screws Loose can try to Smoke Bomb so that Alatreon lands of his own volition when he loses sight of you. The reason I decided to make this video is really twofold. Firstly, my Final Fantasy VII Rebirth critique ended up being pretty long, and I really didn't want my subscribers to have to wait 2 months with no video. But more importantly, I really wanted to stress that the problems with this fight are not the DPS check, or the elemental shifting, or the instant kill AoE attacks, or the Dragon Blight, or really any of the mechanics. Yes, it's particularly annoying when Alatreon stuns you or pins you, especially solo, because depending on the circumstances, it can basically amount to a guaranteed cart. But otherwise, this battle is probably the most precisely balanced in the entire game. I totally get if you don't like that, though. The real problem is actually that it punishes the core elements of Monster Hunter World's grind, and in the process it grinds progress to a halt right near the end of the primary post-game. Monster Hunter thrives specifically because the grind is so fair. As I discuss in my other video, there are many ways to get the materials you need. You can often refund materials in their entirety to spend them on other things, and you have a lot of flexibility for both what equipment you go after and what type of hunts you tackle for that monster or weapon you use, to maximize the chances that you get the resources you need. What you want and need is usually no more than a couple of hunts away, which is phenomenal when other games might expect hours and hours of grinding the same exact mission in the hope that you get the right rare drop with the right rare stat rolls or whatever. I haven't spent over 350 hours in World and another 125 into Rise before even starting Sunbreak because I desperately needed some piece of equipment that the game just refused to give me. Once I learned what was up, basically every single hour spent in these games has been spent doing the things I wanted to be doing. But Alatreon kicks that idea in the teeth because it's so specific in what it expects of you. Unless you're really lucky in your build preferences, you will be grinding random hunts, and grinding up your guiding lands level, and grinding for armor spheres and such in order to ready yourself. And that's only for the required Alatreon fight. There are 2 alternative ones. One that mirrors that one so that it's repeatable, and another that starts at the ice element and works backwards. That necessitates finding an entirely different weapon, set of decorations, and equipment that will defend against ice instead of fire. I appreciate that they were willing to try something weird with Alatreon as a hunt, especially if you're someone who has gotten comfortable with Monster Hunter to the point that even a furious Rajang or two isn't that scary. It can be nice to sink your teeth into a fight that breaks you in half if you aren't prepared, but it's really not fun to get poor communication of the central pillars of the fight strategy, and then to have to stop everything in order to spend hours and hours preparing for it. When you stack that up with the fact that summoning help will only benefit you if you get people who know what they're doing, it can ruin the fun and creativity of the fight. Especially if, like me, you got unlucky with the build you usually use. I generally only play with one or two specific people that I know in real life, and am in a chat party with. So I usually use the Tigrex armor with its boosted free meal, earplugs, and wide range. Then I combine it with tremor resistance and quick sheath so that I'm a party healing powerhouse. And my weapon? The Raging Brachydios hammer that does blast buildup, but is otherwise non-elemental. That means going in, I had terrible dragon and fire resistance, and no way to do effective ice damage. It's enjoyably difficult once all of your ducks are in a row, but up to that point it kinda sucks, and that, well, it sucks. Here's to hoping Fatalis ends up more enjoyable, because I'm simply not into the idea of doing another 10-hour side adventure to find one of a handful of builds that even has a shot of winning.